building a low-carbon economy requires a massive overhaul of the way we live and work. Transitioning away from coal, the world's most dominant and most carbon-intensive source of energy, is the most urgent step to ensuring a clean energy future. Over the past 2 decades, the World Bank Group has provided more than $3 billion to support the closure of coal mines and power plants, and to ensure a just transition that safeguards jobs and income. But there is so much more to do. A well-managed just transition is not only about phasing out coal, but also creating new skills, new jobs, and a more equal, resilient economy. How can we advance climate action so that the transition is both inclusive and fair? What key policy reforms are needed to achieve a just transition that incorporates gender equality, diversity and inclusion, and how can we finance this transition? How can we innovate for climate to put people and communities at the heart of a climate-resilient future?
Please welcome to the stage your host for Innovate for Climate, Communications Lead Sustainable Development at the World Bank, Miriam Gray.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to I4C's third and final plenary session, Making Climate Action Work for All, an inclusive and just transition. Before we get started, we invited Her Excellency Rania Al-Marshad, Minister of International Cooperation in Egypt, to be with us today. Sadly, she couldn't make it, but she sent us this message. Let's take a listen.
Dear distinguished guests, esteemed members of the World Bank Group, development partners, private sector, civil society, and everyone who's participating today. It brings me great pleasure that I'm with you for the Innovate for Climate in the 7th edition, a very important gathering that brings together all stakeholders to discuss the most imminent and important issues that affect us every day. Although the whole world is collectively cooperating to find suitable, sustainable solutions to the compounded crises that the world is currently facing, climate change, development, and innovation are 3 interlinked expressions where the international community and developing countries are trying to determine the best equation to achieve them. Here comes the importance of partnerships by all players to achieve economic development that would include climate change targets through innovation. Addressing both development and climate change issues would require innovation in finance, technology, as well as different models of partnerships and philanthropy. Finance is at the heart of what all of us need to be working together on to combat climate change. Mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, as well as climate technology all require sufficient funds to function properly and to yield desired results, which require the engagement of IFIs, governments, central banks, commercial banks, institutional investors, private sector, as well as other financial actors. Involving the private sector expertise in the development of private and private-public finance solutions can support climate action and encourage private participation in the green transition. Ladies and gentlemen, the Egyptian government through the last decade has successfully passed several economic reforms that have stood buffers against the current global crises. In this regard, in 2015, we issued the National Climate Change Council, which was also updated in 2019. Moreover, and more recently, in May 2022, Egypt demonstrated its adherence to the Paris Climate Agreement through its National Climate Change Strategy. And this strategy was key in bringing up together our country platform, the nexus of water, food, and energy, which we launched during COP27, and were able to mobilize financing from the different partners in order to push our climate action. The climate agenda has been on the forefront of global priorities, and Egypt hosts and takes the presidency of COP27, and there has been plenty that we pushed during our meetings here in Sharm el-Sheikh. As I mentioned, in the pursuit of achieving a more innovative, coordinated approach with our development partners, philanthropists, and private sector, our country platform, the Nexus of Water, Food, and Energy, the NWAFI program, was launched as a platform to mobilize climate investments. In Arabic, NWAFI translates into fulfilling pledges, and this is exactly what the government of Egypt is set out to do and deliver to the people for a more resilient and inclusive future. Our goal goes beyond Nouafi's national success. Nouafi aims at sparking hope of what is being done in Egypt and also could be replicated and scaled up regionally and globally. Moreover, and in line with the global sentiment for a financial cooperative governance framework, Egypt has launched at COP27 an international framework for innovative finance titled the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing. It's a framework that aims to move global commitments into action and provides the how of how we can move blended finance into projects in an investable way. I would like to express my appreciation to the World Bank's Group constructive and long-lasting partnership with the government of Egypt towards achieving its Sustainable Development Goals, Vision 2030, as well as our 2050 climate strategy. In alignment with our national efforts, Egypt newly launched its country partnership, the CPF, with the World Bank Group, particularly focusing on the objectives to strengthen Egypt's adaptation to climate change and mitigation measures under potential areas identified within our Egypt Country Climate and Development Report, the CCDR, which was also launched at COP27. Moreover, with I4C and others, we are working to develop new sustainable cities, and the first showcase of the APEX application at COP27 to create a global conversation around priorities for decarbonizing larger cities. Also, with EBRD's Green Cities Initiatives, a flagship program launched in 2016 to support cities in its transition to a green, low-carbon, and resilient future through targeted investments, policy action, as well as building capacity. Finally, during COP, we also launched a global competition for Innovators Climate Tech Run. Most of the runner-ups worked on adaptation solutions, and we were very happy to announce the winners at COP27. In conclusion, climate change demands swift and collective response from all stakeholders. It is time to move from pledges to implementation, and we are gathered to outrun climate change together through innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency Rani El Mashat, for those inspiring words. And now to today's discussion on just transition. We all know that low-carbon resilient transition will be complex. It will require a holistic approach that goes beyond top-down policies and takes into account the needs of people and communities. But what will make the transition just? What will make it inclusive, incorporating gender and diversity? How do we really put people and communities at the heart of this approach? To take us through this conversation with a great group of people and panelists, let me welcome Jennifer Serra, Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. Jennifer, over to you.
So thank you, Miriam, and good morning to everyone. Good morning again. It's been a wonderful last few days. I hope all of you have enjoying this event as much as I am. My biggest challenge is not being able to go to all the workshops at the same time. But I'm really, really delighted this is a really important conversation that we're going to have this morning on the just transition towards a low carbon future. And we have a wonderful panel of very experienced people who can talk to us about this and share their experiences. So I'd like to welcome on stage our panelists. And joining us today, we have Laura Martin Murillo, who's the General Director of the Just Transition Institute in Spain. We are delighted to have Joyce Mendez, who's joining us from South America. She's a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Welcome, Joyce. And finally, my colleague and friend, Demetrius Papataneusiou, who's the Energy and Extractives Global Director at the World Bank. So welcome, Demetrius. Wonderful to have you. So why is it important for us to unpack the just transition? First, what we really want to do, and let me move over here to be with my panelists, what we really want to do, first of all, is to see if the definition that we all have of just transition can be more open and inclusive. Can it go beyond what we have traditionally understood by this approach? So we really want to dive deep into the approach. We also want to, as we dive deep into the approach, you want to know what is working, what is not working, what can be fixed, and what can people learn? Other companies, countries, what can we learn from each other? And finally, what's next? What does the future hold to deliver a meaningful just transition that leaves no one behind? So before I turn to the live panelists, I would like to kick us off. We have the Chile's Minister of Energy, His Honorable Diego Pardo, and he's going to share with us his thoughts on Chile's efforts to implement a just transition, and in particular how they involve the private sector, which is very important. And what, if anything, is the big lesson he wants other policymakers to know as they embark on this journey. So let's welcome, by video, Honorable Minister of Energy of Chile.
We are experiencing a very challenging energy transition in many ways. In particular, the most difficult part is reconciling short-term demands and challenges, which are numerous, with a medium and long-term vision. Our starting point is clear. We agree to be carbon neutral and climate resilient country by 2050. In this sense, the energy sector has a tremendous potential and responsibility. We must carry out this entire energy transition process, ensuring it is good news for people. The phase out of the coal industry should lead to the development of a new, non-polluting industry. We must also harmonize the objectives of climate and environmental justice with the protection of jobs and the local development of communities of our country that have for so long housed polluting industry. In December 2021, we launched the Just Energy Transition Strategy after a participatory process, including a work plan structured in 4 main areas. First, transition with a focus on the people, with communities at the center of action. 2, economic and productive development. 3, environmental development and a territorial approach. And 4, participatory governance and public and private regulation. To work with these 4 areas, we have been working on several actions, such as the Energy Poverty Roundtable, the upcoming Green Hydrogen Action Plan for 2023-2030, tariff protection, among many others. Those tangible things help us to reach the goal of a people-centered transition. We are also collecting social labor information in the communities where the coal-fired power plants are installed. This information will serve as a basis for the Ministry of Labor to develop and execute labor reconversion plan, to the Ministry of Economy to develop strategies for the productive reconversion and green jobs, and finally, the Ministry of Environment to incorporate this action into the environmental and social programs of the affected cities. We are facing a tremendous task, and we need everyone involved. Within this complexity, green hydrogen and synthetic fuel represent an opportunity to make the energy industry compatible with creating more added value, since we are moving to a more complex value chain that provides opportunity to further industrialize our economy. Finally, our main lesson learned is that for a fair transition, it is essential to count on the commitment of the industry, the involvement of citizens and civil society, and the contribution of academia, technical training centers, vocational school, colleges, initial education, and international expertise. Only with this way we will be able to advance toward a sustainable, productive development that promotes the benefits of people who live in our country. Thank you for watching.
So thank you. That was some wonderful words from very important insights from Chile and from a policymaker perspective. Policy, people, participation, I mean, repeat that over and over again. That's really what it's about. I think I like the way the minister referred to this as the energy transition puzzle. It is a puzzle. So let's start on that note. And Laura, maybe I can turn to you first. As the director of the Just Transition Institute, you have really good hands-on experience on implementing a just transition in Spain. Maybe can you just tell us what has just transition meant for you in the context of your work? How do we go beyond thinking of it this only as an energy transition or a coal transition? Who needs to be involved and why and how?
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's great to be here. I'm the director of the Just Transition Institute that was established in Spain in 2020. So it's a recent institution. And this institution is a directorate general, depending on the Ministry for Ecological Transition, a little bit at the same level that the energy policies or the climate policies. So we thought that Just Transition had to be institutionally an angle that we can really help to smooth the transition. We passed a just transition strategy for Spain, and this is, following your question, this is a wider approach that only focusing on coal. Is what do we have to do to boost opportunities? That is very important. I mean, you have to boost employment, above all in countries like, for example, in Spain, when we had high unemployment rates. Second, which are the vulnerable sectors? Where do you have to pay special attention? Third, consumers. Is this energy transition going to affect particularly vulnerable consumers? Four, labor market active policies and social protection policies and vocational training. And then we had this urgent plan for phasing out coal. But it was meant wider from the very first beginning. Of course, the Institute is not, I mean, we don't have the mandate to do training policies or industry policies, but we are the convenient intermediator between different ministers for the case where we see these vulnerable situations. With the phase out of coal, we started in 2019, December 2018, and it has been, we managed to do it in a kind of an agile manner. At this moment, we had 15 coal power plants, and all of them are in a closing process that will end in 2025. And at this moment, we have already reduced the participation of coal in our electricity mix beyond 80%. So it's happening fast. For coal mines happening in 2019, and for coal power plants is happening. And that was important for our purpose of reducing emissions. But what it was more important, it was how we accompany these territories, how we accompany these communities in the way to decarbonization. And what we did is trying to involve as much people as possible. First, we had to have agreements with the direct impacted by the change. And so we had 2 agreements with unions and companies for coal mines and also for coal power plants, and that was sectoral agreements, national wide, that help us to deal with these direct impacted workers through occupational training, new jobs, but also we wanted to work with communities, and I said that was going to the territories, we have to build something different. We have to learn from all voices. It doesn't matter if they are companies at the local level, local authorities are key, NGOs, women groups. So we made a participatory process in 15 places that are in this closing process, and we managed to engage more than 800 relevant agents in the territory, and with them with their ideas, with their proposals, with their concerns, is what we managed to start building solutions for these territories.
Well, this is wonderful. It's such an inspiration, and congratulations to Spain for shutting down 15 coal mines. But I think you're also highlighting participation, consultation, everyone working together. So let me turn to you, Joyce. Climate change is an intergenerational issue, and of course, it's climate action. I always say, the younger generation, we need you to come and clean up the mess that we're leaving you behind. What is the role? How do you see youth can be involved? How can we work together on all of this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Aisha, hello everybody. Yes, basically, as we see, youth are catalysts for transformation. We make, it's like the catalyst in chemistry is like this it speeds a reaction. That's how I feel like working with like youth across, like the Americas, in the way that we have this disruptive thinking, but also we are first, right? If we want to have a prosperous future, we have to engage in climate action. And we are doing in different, ways to localize the action. So we know the global frameworks, the regional perspectives, but the action is local, right? So this localization is fundamental for us to bridge actually our communities, local communities, to the global aspects. And also, as you said, aspect of intergenerational justice. So I want to share with you, there is a call for action for human rights. It's called the Rights for Future Generations from the United Nations. And it says there is a part on just transition, on the rights for future generations. The link, crisis of climate change, environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, and pollution violate the rights of countless people every day, and they're being threatened the effective enjoyment of human rights for future generations. Those who are more vulnerable have contributed the least to suffer the worst impacts. This raises questions of justice, peace, security, and equity between and among the nations and generations. Climate actions must be taken at all levels and by all actors. So again, intergenerational cooperation is not just, oh, we are including youth, but how we are doing it and which youth, because we're also a diverse group. So I think this is the way I see youth in this process action. And one tangible example perhaps I'll give you, for example, talking about energy, following as well the line. There is a group I'm part of, it's called the SDG 7 Youth Constituency, as part of the UN Major Group of Children and Youth, and we have created the Sustainable Energy Hub, the Youth Sustainable Energy Hub. So you can go online, you can check this platform, and it's an amazing platform. You can see examples of youth action across the energy transition around the world. And it's really not just inspiring, but we are also like trying to foster as well the relationships, this North-South and South-South cooperation.
Wonderful, I can't wait. I'm going to go look at that, Youth Energy Sustainability Hub. I like what you're saying, think global, act global, human rights for future generations, the UN, but act local. Action is local, and I think that's a really good message. Demetrius, so we've heard everyone's talking about employment, how important green growth jobs are for this energy transition, but from your perspective, where you sit as the Global Director for Energy and Extractives, how can we innovate to scale up the energy transition in the countries that are working in the developing countries?
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, and good morning to everyone. First of all, I think it's important that we understand the level of challenge we're facing. Coal is still producing about a third of the world's global emissions. And if you look at the numbers, in just the last decade, the world's installed capacity of coal has doubled in a decade. And it's still growing. It is not going down. And I think the major challenge that we're seeing is that for most countries, energy is still, and availability of energy is much more important than dealing with climate change. In fact, we have several OECD countries that even today, they're burning coal at very substantial quantities for electricity generation. Now, we recently issued a report called Scaling Up to Phase Down. And in this report, we try to put together a comprehensive framework of what the world needs so that we can have the energy transition. And one of the points that we raise in that report is that if you look at the actual numbers, the level of emissions that are coming from coal today, our understanding is that we need to retire in the next 17, 18 years about 2,000 gigawatts of coal capacity. That means that every year, 100,000 megawatts of coal capacity need to be retired. And if you do the numbers, that means that every day from now for the next 18 to 20 years, one generating unit of coal thermal power plants needs to be shut down. And it is an enormous challenge, especially in the developing world, because in the developing world, we are not still able to supply the growing demand for electricity and for energy services. So how do we bring all of these things together? So the first point is that before, especially in the developing world, before we can have a proper conversation about what does it take to shut things down, we have to make sure that we provide sufficient clean energy alternatives that can supply the growing demand for electricity. So this is an enormous challenge, but it is clearly an enormous opportunity, and that is where jobs can come as well. We estimate that the investments on clean energy in the developing world, excluding China, which is very large by itself, need to go from about 250 million at the level that we are today to about $1 trillion every year by 2030 and then keep on growing their own. So this is clearly a tremendous challenge, mobilizing all this capital, but it also is a great opportunity for investment, and it's a great opportunity for shifting jobs towards clean energy. So that's number one. We have to find the resources and shift investment into clean energy. Then the second item is that we have to accept the fact that to do a proper coal transition and accelerate it as we actually need to do, especially if we want to stand the chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, then we need to accept that we will be stranding assets. That means that value, financial value that is in these 2,000 gigawatts of coal power plants will have to be in one way or the other destroyed and compensated for. Mm-hmm. Again, this is very substantial. Our current estimates is that we're talking for about an additional $1 trillion on just compensating the assets that need to be stranded by early retirement. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we have to, in terms of innovation, we have to first of all figure out a way of bringing carbon credit markets into this space. Article 6, especially on the international side, is really not working, and it's definitely not working yet in terms of compensating the early retirement of coal power plants. So these are fundamental resources. They need to come on the table, and we need on top of those to figure out how do we compensate people and communities that will be affected by the change. Now, there are ways to reduce the cost, and we can talk about them in more detail. But the reality is that this is a major financial undertaking. It requires policies, it requires institutions like the one you established in Spain so that you're able to carry it out. And then it requires the mobilization of public and private capital for the transition.
So thank you, Demetrius. Very sobering, but I think it's important to set the targets and the goals. If you have to shut down a coal plant every day and the money, you know, both the money for green energy to replace the dirty energy with clean energy, but then what it takes to shut it down, and of course all the investments in the communities. Joyce, let me come back to you. How do we really make sure that the youth are effectively heard in decision-making processes? Because we know now the youth we always have a youth on the stage, right? But that's one thing to be on stage, but how do we really, really have action, voice?
And not just heard, but also like, you know, like, to be able that we can also just sit at the table, talk, but also to have an outcome also back to our community. So as we know, we're talking about like shifting the energy matrix, and this will create obviously like many jobs, also many challenges. But however, it's like there is a responsibility, right, as well for like, you know, like youth to have process of reskilling. We need like the process of capacity building, training, that we have also options for internships, so we can get, you know, to have skills exactly for the transition right now, and so we are not, you know, like behind, and that it being young will not be an excuse like, oh, you're not prepared enough, or you don't have, you know, the knowledge that is required. Also, why not, I'll say it as well, that youth targets and quotas as well, like from, you know, we have been seeing a shift in for example, in the delegations that go to COP, like the participation of youth is fundamental because we can ensure the sustainability of the proposals being developed today, right? And as well, we can skip, you know, having, you know, we can progress in a faster way, but in the same time, it's not just having youth because we are young, exactly like my case here, but we have certain expertise. So for example, in this conference, I met amazing young colleagues, and they are leading the transition in their community. So I also would like to see them, you know, as speakers in as well future versions of this event, and as well, access to financing. I will say this is fundamental because we know we have an international architecture for climate finance, but when is this going to reach youth in our communities? Are they training us for us to be able to reach this? Because at the end of the day, it's not lack of ideas or perspectives, but it's also tangible results. And we need this, you know, intergenerational cooperation to make our participation effective and not based on youth washing.
No, thanks, Joyce. That's great. I mean, it really is. It's coming back to local action. You know, the youth's voice, but then giving you the skills, capacity, and resources to be able to also take action. So Laura, let me follow up on that same point about how do we integrate the big picture and the little picture. I don't know if it's a little picture, the local action, because we know that the policy decisions on climate change and climate action has to be taken really at a national level, centralized. You said it's all the different agencies working together, setting the targets. But we know the impacts of the transition of shutting down a coal mine is very localized, it's decentralized. And so how do you approach this asymmetry? How do you balance between the local action and the national targets and policy? And how do you hold policy makers accountable to the communities? How do you bring it all together?
Well, in our climate change and energy transition law, we have the obligation of anticipate the difficulties every 5 years that we are going to have in the process of full decarbonization for 2050. And what we propose when we identify these communities that are vulnerable is what we call the Just Transition Agreements. That is basically an agreement between all administrations, of course, regional governments, but also local authorities to work together at the same time, to work as a team, really. It is very interesting from the governmental perspective, from the central administration, to really think local. I mean, we have to think local. It doesn't matter if we are based in Madrid. So we have this agreement. We go all together with the regional governments and the local authorities, and we look for common solutions. And that is important because sometimes we are talking about impacts are sub-regional government level. And also, sometimes there are communities in Spain with very low population rates. I mean, there are small places out of the big picture. Sometimes they are not. So that thing, it has to happen also at the team. I mean, we have people from the central administration working in the territories and helping companies there and having like a direct access. And as I tell you, it is one of the things that we have promote more. That is this collaboration where with all levels of the administration, we have the same target. That is from the Just Transition Agreement. That is, this is going to close, but it has to generate zero impact on jobs and zero impact on population. And that is a huge commitment with communities. But if we wanted to be ambitious on climate, we also had to be ambitious for these territories. And you have to be creative also, because it's not only replacing, for instance, jobs or activities one from another, and it's not only coal by renewables, because you have to pay attention, for instance, to incomes in the territories, and that is important. So part of the work we did with the utilities in this agreement, it was they are part of the business. They produce electricity with coal, and they are going to keep on producing electricity with renewables. So what can you do for these communities? What are your ideas besides renewables that are important, but sometimes not so much interesting in job terms? What can we do? What industry can we bring with? How we interact with these renewables with, for instance, indigenous resources like agriculture? How to provide interesting electricity rates through self-consumption to communities or to small and medium enterprise in order to diversify the economy. So we are really thinking very much in these Just Transition Agreements. We are running 15, and they are completely different one to another, because we need to find different solutions of future that are sensible and that take into account the indigenous resources we have in each of the territories. For me, it's a privilege, because it's true that working for the government at national level, but being able to talk to people at local level and see how can you transform that reality is something that, I mean, I'm a privilege in the national government area, I think.
No, thank you very much, Laura. I mean, and I think the legal framework that you said, there's a legal framework up above, but there's a Just Transition Agreement, then you customize, co-create solutions that are local. I really like this when you say that it's a privilege. I feel every day working at the World Bank, the opportunity that we have, Demetrius, the privilege also of being able to support so many different countries and learning and sharing knowledge across it. Can you drill down a little bit on some examples of operations where the World Bank has supported clients in the area of transition? Walk us through an example, what it would look like.
So I think the most interesting experience and an interesting story by itself has been the work that we did in South Africa, which is the first project done in the developing world on retiring a coal power plant. So this is the Komati power plant, which is in the north of South Africa. And I think it's a particularly interesting story because it is the World Bank that back in the early 1970s was involved in financing the first coal thermal power plant in South Africa. And now, almost half a century later, we have almost come full circle and we're helping South Africa in decommissioning that first coal power plant. Now, the challenges are multifold. The cost of the project is about $450 million. The bulk of the financing is to do environmental cleaning and bringing down some parts of the coal power plant. And the bulk of the financing is going into investments for solar energy, for batteries, trying to take advantage of the unique position of the power plant within South Africa's transmission network. However, about 50 million out of the 450, so that's a bit more than 10%, is funding that goes in dealing with all the problems and the challenges that Laura mentioned that we're facing whenever we have to retire coal power plant. There's about 15,000 people associated with the operations around the Komati power plant. A lot of them are involved in the supply chain of coal. And in the case of the developing world, mining for coal is actually the good jobs. These are well-paid, secure jobs. And we were estimating when we did a social assessment in South Africa that for every miner that was associated with a coal that would feed power plants in South Africa in the north, we would indirectly support another 10 people. So the level of social disruption that comes into whenever we have to decommission coal power plants is quite significant. And the methods that we're deploying there are very similar to what you're doing here. We're trying to figure out what are the skills that these people have and can be redeployed elsewhere, how we can give them incentives to move. In the case of South Africa, mining is a very important industry. About 10% of the GDP of South Africa is associated with mining. So a lot of the skills that miners have in coal can be transferable in the industry. But in many cases, it means they have to relocate, which by itself is an additional cost. So we need to assess which are the people that can be employed elsewhere and then provide assistance so that they can move in other areas. Then we have to look at how do we deal with people that are going to be staying in the region and what are the other economic opportunities that can be developed around the region, and that requires additional investment. And we have to deal with the younger generation that in many cases, as I said, these operations have been running for more than half a century. They were going from generation to generation. So all of that requires a plan. It requires consultations with the communities. And it also requires a forward look. At the end of the day, these are costs that are necessary, and we're going to have to be doing this at a massive scale globally if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degrees. So the good news is that we have a much better understanding of the challenges. We have developed what we call a 3x3, which is a methodology of how do you do the just transition, how do you deal with the people, the communities, the governance matters, and how do you deal with the environmental impacts of the transition. And then how do you think about it in the short term, in the medium, and in the longer term. So we really have a clear idea about how this is to be done. The financial resources that are required are quite substantial still. I don't want to underplay that. And also, especially in the developing world, we have to keep on working to create reliable, clean energy alternatives, which remains a big challenge.
Thank you very much, Demetrios. And it's actually, fascinating and how similar it is. I remember we were just talking before you came on stage, Laura, about also the jobs, the quality of the jobs that people who work in the coal mining industry, the mineral. They actually have good jobs. They're well paying. So it's not that easy. You need to actually replace them with different kind of jobs. And as you say, Demetrius, either in the same location or to relocate them. So it is incredibly disruptive in how important it is to be working together on finding the solution. But Joyce, let's talk, I want to come back to the concept of climate justice. And because climate justice really does recognize the disproportionate impacts of climate change, especially on disadvantaged groups of population around the world. A lot of times the groups they're not responsible for the emissions, and they're most impacted by the emissions. So maybe from your perspective, what do you see the difference? We're talking about just transition, and then we talk about climate justice. And how do you see, are there synergies with the two concepts?
Sure. So basically, what I see in the perspective is like the just transition can be seen through many lenses that we have been discussing, like intergenerational equity, energy democracy, energy poverty and access, women's rights, energy justice, workers' rights, and climate justice, or also environmental justice. So if we see that there are different concepts where we're talking equality, equity, and justice. And what are the differences and how we apply this? So actually equality is to provide, obviously, with the same conditions in order, to have this just transition. But also the equity is to provide different conditions depending on the different populations. And justice is to eliminate these barriers. So as I see, basically climate justice, leverage environmental leverage the just transition. And as we see, the current efforts targeting climate justice are also part of the just transition. So it's like a process, they are related, as you said, it's part of this kind of puzzle, taking into account, obviously, that for every situation we need to evaluate. So the just transition, we can have a global perspective, again, like the action, and in different countries we see which is the vulnerable population that we need to support, right? Indigenous peoples, rural people as well, and youth, and how do we do it? But there are a lot of interlinkages among those perspectives, and I think they both complement each other.
No, okay, great, and I like that. You're saying the climate justice is the bigger framing under which the just transition, we can have quality, equity, and justice. Laura, let me come back to you, and let's talk about gender and women. What are the opportunities? Do you have a differentiated approach to ensure the involvement and inclusion of women in the ecological transition? What are the key elements to make sure that everyone participates?
Well, in the work we have been undertaken, that is phasing out coal and provide new opportunities, I mean, it's all communities and all of these jobs, including coal power plants, are so male-dominated. I mean, they were economies and activities very dominated by men. So when you propose to create new employments, you basically can do a transition that is just in those terms, but then coming from male-dominated activities to male-dominated activities, and that is not going to be fair. It was an opportunity changing, it was an opportunity to improve the participation of women in those communities where these good jobs were a main issue. So we have been working with that in perspective, and through our grants, for instance, the intensity of our aid is bigger if you hire women. And that is giving results. I mean, from the different grant support in small and medium enterprises at local level, already 40% of the jobs that are supported by our grants are for women. And that is a huge change from a sector where we had a participation of 2 or 3%. That was more or less, I mean, the direct workers. So we were paying attention to that. We were also paying attention to create meetings with women entrepreneurship. Not only, well, we wanted to support women projects in those territories. Some of these women that stay in rural areas have a lot of difficulties to bring their ideas into reality. So we are paying attention into that, and we have to grow doing that. But also it imports even the access. I mean, as we are creating a much more open administration, and we have a team that talk to people all the time, you realize that people that have my telephone number or to phone me are men, mostly. So you have to also engage with women at local level and feel comfortable to share with you their proposals and we are also trying to change that. And in general terms, we are about to launch a study that we have been collaborating. It's part of our objectives in the Just Transition strategy is to ensure this gender equality. So we have been studying from the first time in Spain the participation of women in jobs of the energy transition, not of the energy sector as a whole, but of the energy transition. And we are about to launch the results. No surprise, participation rate is low, it's around 17%. But in the last years, 4 of 10 jobs created were for women. So it is improving slightly. I mean, in these new jobs, it is improving. For gender gap, we are below the media, so we are below average, and that's good. But still, we have subsectors that are completely masculinized, and that's what we are dealing. So we are going to work also in proposals on how to do an energy transition that is also a better opportunity for women.
No, thank you. I mean, that's wonderful, because I think that's the important thing, is how do you reach out to women, but to indigenous groups, to youth, to all the different segments of the population who are part of the just transition. I think it's important sometimes you need different instruments and different ways to be able to give them that more than just the seat at the table, but a participation role. Demetrius, you're the one who's constantly reminding us of the cost of all this, right? And I think it's important. And you talk about many countries still have urgent energy needs. And I think, and that you were talking about that, the justice, and that everyone has the same right to all the SDGs that everyone else does in SDG 7. How do you make sure, though, as we help countries transition to provide energy access to all in a clean way, that you don't forget about the just transition that you added on as an afterthought? Oh, let's put another $15 million on the project, and hopefully that will take care of it. I mean, so how do we mobilize the investment, and how do we actually put the justice into the investments that we're mobilizing?
Right, I think this is the major challenge. Again, our estimate is, and just focusing on the coal power plants again, about 90% of the new coal power plants are in lower income countries and middle income countries. This is 90% of these thousands of gigawatts that need to be retired. And these are, in most cases, especially in Africa, these are places that have contributed very little to greenhouse gas emissions. So the issue of justice affects, the issue of climate justice affects things in 2 ways. First of all, we have the poorest of the people who are going to be the most vulnerable, and they're going to be hit harder by the effects of climate. And usually these are the people that actually have had very little to contribute in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions themselves. So we need to recognize this. I mean, at the end of the day, it is the richer countries that have to carry more of the financial burden of doing the energy transition. And this is something the World Bank has been advocating for some time, that we have to find the right balance, and the need to be flows going from OECD countries to lower income and middle income countries to assist them with the energy transition. Again, as I said, in our approach on how can we actually do this, not just talk about it, is we have to really scale up clean energy, which will then allow us to have a more intelligent conversation about phasing down all fossil fuel alternatives. So to do that, we need to help countries with starting what we call a virtuous cycle. So we need, with a dialogue, with the initial climate conversations, we need to get countries to make an initial commitment for clean energy. Then we can help them with setting in place the laws and regulations that will enable investments towards some of these clean energy projects. We need to be supporting institutions that then will create a pipeline of bankable clean energy projects. And at that point, we can deploy de-risking instruments, and in the multilateral development banks, we have ways and means of doing that, and we have been doing it around the world with quite good results. And that will attract the private capital that through competitive auctions, actually in most cases, especially today, yields the results that demonstrate that clean energy is actually cheaper in the medium to longer term compared to coal. And whenever we've done that, and whenever we've seen countries experiencing that actually clean energy can be cheaper, and when they see that with real projects, and when we manage to do this with attracting private capital, the immediate result is that they increase their ambition for accelerating the energy transition. And then we can start that, what we call the virtue cycle again. We do need to have climate financing, especially in the initial stages, in the first round of the cycles. And it is important that this is deployed, intelligently, and so that we can really attract the massive amounts of private capital that we need for the transition. And then once this goes in place, then we need to again deploy climate financing in thinking about how do we deal with the costs of shutting down fossil fuel power plants, especially on the coal side, dealing with the issues of communities and the environmental impacts, and trying to extract more value of the remaining assets by repurposing them or by using the land that is associated there for additional investments. So it can be done. I think this is the good news. It can be done, and we have a very clear idea about how it is to be done. What we need to be doing more is communicating that this approach is sensible, it has been shown to demonstrate, and then make sure that the initial capital, especially on concessional climate financing, can come in to kickstart this virtue cycle.
No, thank you, Dimitris. I think that's important because the way I understand what you're saying is that part of the just transition, the justice part of the transition is also how capital is deployed and what grant and concessional money is used for versus what the private sector can come in to invest in clean renewable energy, but making sure that the community supporting communities, closing down the coal plants, that's where we need to bring in the just money as well, if I understand it correctly. I want to thank the audience for sending in questions. We have a couple more minutes, like 1 minute each for all of you, but most of the questions really are about participation at the local level, be it indigenous communities, and of course, what can the indigenous communities bring in, mentioning here, they really are, they understand the critical ecosystems, so how their views can be incorporated into this justice, but also the youth. We talked even more questions on making sure that we have effective decision making, but how do we make it happen now in the short term, not that we're going to talk about this for another 10 years. And so just 1 minute from each of you, quickly, how do you really, really make sure the transition is just? What is it, like 2 or 3 things that will make you feel like this was really done in a just way, an inclusive way? It's a difficult question, but let's just go down the line.
Okay. I think first you have to mean it. I mean, you have to have your purpose written, approved, or in your national policies. It cannot be like something you do when you do climate policies, and then it has to be just. I mean, if you mean it to be just, you have to think how you are going to make it. And it's going to be different, and you are going to encounter other difficulties that you have to face. So I think minute is important, and translate it into national policies is important. Then you have also to provide the tools, and that is money, and that is also a public and private partnership. I mean, bringing companies, bringing sectors in that transition. And it's also, I mean, you have to put more resources, not only for funding projects. You have to put more human resources in order to have projects that are relevant for the territories you are working in. And that, I think that's important.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Dimitris, and I'm going to let Joyce have the last word. So Dimitris, what is for you?
I think, first of all, we should not lose track of the fact that this is really an emergency. We are seriously in danger of running out of time. So this is number one. Continue to communicate and continue to remind everyone that we are facing a climate emergency. If we look at the numbers, the latest IPCC numbers basically say that we have an available space of around 380 gigatons in the atmosphere if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees. But the rate of emissions globally is 40 gigatons. So we have, if we continue at this level, we have less than 10 years and then we're done. So we really are at an emergency, and I think it's important to continue to talk about that. And then if we are in an emergency, then we really need emergency measures to deal with it. And that means that we have to get serious about allocating the resources at the financial level, at doing the plans that need to be put in place, and mobilizing the investments. So I would argue that continue to articulate that this is an emergency and that we really need emergency measures to deal with it. I think this is fundamental, and we really have absolutely no time to be complacent about how difficult and how challenging the situation is.
No, thank you, Dimitris. Joyce, over to you.
Sure. So I will say, obviously, like first of all, like consultation in the ways of participatory methodologies, always in a different process. Just as well translating information, not just to English or Spanish, the main languages, but making sure people is well informed about the different projects, about the different, like financing and mechanisms and everything. Second, yeah, financing. It takes cash to care. Like in many countries, we are struggling for it. And three, I will say third, mapping and following up as well the different projects, and not just, oh, we have done this, we have done, but what are the results, what are the, like how to communicate, those good practices. And I will say there is a sense of emergency, like in our communities locally, but sometimes when we see how we can influence our governments, sometimes they're like, oh, we are doing okay, we are just growing, we are allowed to pollute, and, in what sense also we can have this feedback and this sense of emergency with the government. I think this is just, it will be a key to unlock and to understand how we can really make actions and to be not just heard, but to have obviously like a full planning nationally back, especially when I'm talking about like Latin America. We have amazing perspectives like the summa causae, the good living. What does the good living paradigm has to say with the just transition?
No, this is fantastic. I'm sure we can go on and on. A fantastic panel. Thank you all so much, because, such real experiences. And I think that's what we need, is to share real life experiences and the knowledge exchange across countries. We have this big, bright red thing that says time's up. And I think that's very pertinent, because this is a climate emergency, climate justice, climate finance, climate emergency. And I think it's important. I really appreciate that it's sad to end like that, but it really is that we need to really keep on being motivated by this, the emergency, that we need to respond to the emergency. I really want to thank all of you. You can keep on sending questions during the day, because we will have a closing ceremony, and some of the questions that are coming in over the last few days, we'll try to also address them at the closing ceremony. But thank you all very, very much. Thank you to the panelists. And let me turn it back over to Miriam to wrap up the session.
Thank you, Jennifer, and to our panelists for this thoughtful and very informative discussion. That brings us to the end of today's plenary. I hope you have had some chance to check out the marketplace. If not, do go walk around before coming back here. Do join the workshops as well. Sadly, today is our last day at I4C, but we will be back, like Jennifer said, at 3 p.m. for the closing ceremony. Doors will open at 10 to 3. Please we'll try to answer as many questions as we get from those submitted. But if you haven't submitted any, please just go. You still have time. We would like to see see all of you at 3 p.m. Please come back. Thank you.